Gordon Chang joins me. He is the author of Nuclear Showdown. North Korea Takes on the World, and indeed, Gordon, an apt title for what we're dealing with right now. What message do we think North Korea was trying to send with Friday's missile test?
There were a couple things. So first of all, of course, they can range the United States. But also, we got to remember that they had us looking at a particular spot in North Korea, Kusong. They fired this missile off from another spot, entirely different, saying that we cannot find their missiles before they're in the air. Also, this was a night launch, making it much more difficult for the U.S. to be able to monitor their activities, again saying we're not going to be able to find their missiles. So this is indeed a sinister warning to the United States.
Okay, so what to be done about it? Warnings, sanctions, tough rhetoric. Nothing seems to be working to hinder Kim Jong-un's nuclear ambitions. U.S. strategic bombers have flown over the Korean Peninsula in recent days. In response, they've tested the THAAD missile system. At what point does the U.S. intervene, potentially with force? Is that even an option?
Well, it is always an option, as we say, but I think that that's far down the road. There are a lot of non-kinetic options we have and which we should try because the use of force could lead to a horrific conflict on the peninsula. So, for instance, the one thing that we haven't done is we haven't imposed real sanctions on China. We started at the end of June with a few minor measures. Those were signals to Chinese President Xi Jinping that we can amp up the pressure. I think we start to need to amp up the pressure on Beijing because, you know, that missile that was fired on Friday and the one on July 4th, they came off of Chinese transporter erector launchers. The North Koreans got a lot of help from the Chinese, and that's why Pyongyang has been able to make such fast progress on their missile program.
All right, well, let's focus in on that U.S.-China relationship. After expressing faith in China months ago, the president is now expressing disappointment. Why doesn't China do more? Talk about the strategic reasons that China might not be playing ball.
Well, I think China likes North Korean provocations. Every time North Korea does something belligerent, fire a missile, detonate a nuke, we run to Beijing, ask for Chinese cooperation, and we stop talking about the things that matter to us. So, for instance, predatory Chinese trade practices, South China Sea, Taiwan, human rights, you name it. The Chinese realize North Korea keeps us off balance, and therefore they are loving this. You know, this couldn't work out any better for the Chinese, at least in the short term. Long term, this is very bad for Beijing, but Chinese leaders are not looking at the long term. They're looking at the here and now.
The president also said, quote, he will handle the problem. That's not policy, obviously. Last night you wrote that North Korea is driving American foreign policy in directions not seen before. What did you specifically mean by that, Gordon? And is that a good thing or a bad thing in your view?
Well, two things. So, for instance, Trump's two-part tweet Saturday night actually changed the basis of U.S.-China policy because it says essentially, look, we're not going to worry about trade. You know, trade's not a good thing with China because trade has been strengthening China and China has not been helping us. That's an important conversation that we need to have because it's critical to the future of the United States. The other thing I was thinking about was our ambassador to the UN, Nikki Haley, saying that diplomacy is done. You know, we don't hear American diplomats saying that diplomacy is useless. And so this is clearly unprecedented territory for the United States. And indeed, I think that we're having a conversation about looking at our foreign relations with Beijing. And it's a long overdue thing. I'm not sure where we need to end up, but nonetheless, I think we need to talk about our policies towards the Chinese.
I'll push back on you just a little bit. Isn't it sort of an oversimplification to assume that only Chinese has benefited from the trade relationship? After all, a lot of the cheap goods that American consumers have here are made in China.
Yeah, I agree with you. But on the other hand, we can have our shoes and our toys made by our friends. We can help our friends develop their economy. We have an interest, for instance, a very strong interest in a strong Mexican economy. So the question is, why are we buying stuff from China when we can buy it from Mexico? This is a question that the United States needs to answer, because I think we should be helping our friends rather than a country that means us harm.
The U.S. is in a Cold War with Russia, I think most experts would say today. Is it a good time to be in another confrontation, potentially another sort of Cold War with another nuclear armed power?
That's a great question. And a lot of people who have been defending Trump's foreign policies, and don't include me in this, but a lot of people have been saying, look, the United States needs Moscow on our side in our confrontation with the Chinese and the North Koreans. That's not an unreasonable position. I mean, I think, though, that the Russians have done things which are completely unacceptable. We cannot have them, for instance, redraw borders by force, Crimea and eastern Ukraine. Also, we cannot let Putin get away with his blackmail using his nuclear arsenal, as he did in August 2014 against the Baltics. So I do believe that we are in a struggle against both the Chinese and the Russians. But, some people say quite legitimately, look, we need to separate the Chinese from the Russians, and so let's pick a side.
President Trump also spoke to Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe today, Gordon, committing the U.S. and Japan to increase diplomatic and economic pressure on North Korea. Can Japan play a larger role?
Yeah, well, Japan certainly can. Japan has a first-rate military. They don't call it that. They call it self-defense forces. But nonetheless, we're going to need all the friends we have in North Asia, and certainly Japan is a crucial member of our coalition. So, yes, they're going to help, and especially the Japanese long term. If you go back a decade or so, we're recommending policies that we should have been implementing. But the United States, with a little bit of arrogance, just sort of pushed the Japanese to the side. I think we have a lot to learn from what the Japanese say about the North Koreans, and indeed also the Chinese as well.
Gordon Chang, thanks so much for your insights as always.
Thank you, Stephanie.